There was a poodle and a collie, and they were walking down the street and they're having a conversation, one with the other. And the poodle looks over to the collie and says, you know what? He says, my life is just a mess. He said, my girlfriend left me for a German Shepherd. I said, I'm as nervous as a hamster. Discouraged, or you felt like life is always just an uphill battle. Seems like you're always struggling to try to get there. You feel like maybe you feel like you're a born loser. You feel discouraged. You think, is things ever going to get better? Well, over 20 centuries ago, there was a small band of Christians who also felt that way and experienced some great turmoil. They were persecuted, they were living in poverty, they were unwelcome. And the one that we're looking at this morning, there was a church, its name was called Smyrna. And if you would leave Ephesus, which we talked about last week, and you would go 40 miles north, you would find this city of Smyrna. Smyrna was known to be a beautiful city. It was said to be the first in size and beauty in Asia. And in fact, that's what was printed on its currency, because it was so beautiful. But they are also highly involved in emperor worship, and they persecuted the Christians, and the Christians did not have an easy time there living, and they were under great persecution. But they also received a letter. And this letter that came to them was a letter of encouragement, words of encouragement from Christ, who wrote the letter through John. And today we're going to look and see, what did he have to say to these people at Smyrna? Now, if you want to follow along, or you'd like to read later today, I would encourage you to do that. You can see these letters that were written to these different churches. But the one today is found in Revelation chapter 2, in verses 8 through 11. I'd like to read those verses to you. And unto the angel of the church in Smyrna, write these things, say, the first and the last, which was dead and is alive. I know thy works and tribulation and poverty, but thou art rich. And I know the blasphemy of them, which say they are Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. Fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devils will cast some of you into prison, that you may be tried, and you shall have tribulation 10 days. And be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. He that overcometh shall not be hurt of the second death. Now that's the letter that Christ wrote to the church of Smyrna. We get discouraged sometimes in life. You say, well, how does this letter was written to the people there, how does that impact us today? How does that relate to us today? Well, we also live in a time sometimes where we become discouraged, and we need that word of encouragement. Jean Niditch, many years ago, went to downtown New York City, and she was a housemaker, and she was overweight, and she weighed 214 pounds, and she went to the New York City Health Department and asked them for a diet to help her lose some weight. Well, after a couple of months, she became discouraged, and she still had 50 plus pounds that she wanted to lose. And so she called 6 of her overweight friends and brought them in, and they talked about how they could lose weight. Now, over 30 years later, and over 1 million members, in 25,000 weekly meetings in 24 countries around the world, Weight Watchers exists. And maybe you know that program. What? We all need encouragement at some time, whether it's a group or what it might be. Maybe you felt that discouragement. Maybe it was a phone call that you got that lifted you up. Maybe it was a kind word that got you up. Maybe God spoke to you and he encouraged you. Maybe somebody came along and they put their arm around you and they gave you a hug and they encouraged you. But we all need that encouragement. And I want you to see that these were believers that were living in great persecution. They were living in great poverty. We face all kinds of challenges today. So what did Christ say to them? How did he try to encourage them? 3 things this morning. Number 1 is this. He first started off his letter with the proof. What do I mean by that? He stated his identity, who he was. These are people who are hurting. These are people who are scared. These are people who are worried for their lives. They're worried for their welfare. How are we going to make it tomorrow? I mean, we think we have concerns. They had real, legitimate concerns. So he starts off what I call the proof. What he wanted to do is he wanted to state for them his identity, who this was. How does he describe himself? He says, I am the first and the last. What does that mean? Christ is supreme before all things and all time, and the goal of all things. What was he saying? He's saying, I am first. I was there before anything happened. I will be there after everything is gone. I will always be there. I have always been there, and I will always be there for you. He's the first and the last. He's stating his identity, that he is the sovereign, he is the supreme, he is over all time, he is over all nature, he is over everything. He said, there's nothing I don't know, there's nothing I'm not over, there's nothing I can't control, there's nothing that I don't know. And he was trying to state this for these people that they would have proof. He was not just a good man, he was the God-man. He said, I want to give you proof of who I am. He said, I've conquered death. Now, back at that time, you have to understand that this town was highly involved in emperor worship. They were enthusiastically Roman supporters. So they loved those Roman emperors, and they were very supportive and involved in worship of the emperors. They looked at the emperor as God incarnate. They were dealing with Egypt, who wrapped up their kings and mummies and said that one day they would come back. And Christ said he was trying to give them proof of who he was. He said, I am the first, I am the last. You might think you've seen everything, but there's nothing that I haven't seen that you have. And I've conquered death, and I'm the only one who's been able to do that. I want to give you proof, because everything else today is what? You go to those tombs in Egypt, you're still going to find those kings wrapped up. You know, you're not going to see anybody else is able to defeat death. Christ is the only one that was able to come forth, and he wanted to give them proof. There was a young man, and his job called him to go to Ireland to work for 2 years. And he was very upset about this because he had a girlfriend, and they were engaged, and he wanted to save money to get married. So they told him that they would, give him this much money, extra money, if he would be willing to go to Ireland. So he thought, well, I'll do this because then I'll be able to save up enough money so I can get married. So while he was over there, they corresponded back and forth, but she was worried about him, getting connected with some other girls, and he would keep writing her back and say, no, I'm being really good, but I got to tell you, there's a lot of beautiful girls in Ireland. So that got her concerned. He said, but don't worry, I'm still true to you. And so she thought, well, what am I going to do, to make sure that he doesn't get involved with another girl? So she sent him a harmonica, and she said, I want you to learn how to play this. So he would correspond back and he'd say, honey, he said, I'm learning how to play the harmonica, and I'm thinking about you every night as I'm practicing. So 2 years came, and it was over. And he got to come back, and he came home, and he flew into Tennessee, and he got off the airport, and he ran up, and he wanted to hug his fiancée. There she was. He went to put his arms around her, and she said, oh, no, you don't. She goes, you play that harmonica first. She wanted proof, all right? Well, you can imagine, these were people who were hurting, and they get a letter. Well, they want proof that somebody that's writing to them is actually going to be able to help them. Have you ever struggled in looking for help, and you go, oh, man, I thought they could help me, and you go, and that person can't help you. You're with somebody else, you thought, it's no good, they can't help me. They were looking for somebody who could help me, and there's people today all over the world and in our country who are looking for somebody who can help them. And God says, I am the first, I am the last. Regardless of what the situation is, I can help you. And that's what he wanted to drill home to these people who were in great poverty. They were in great persecution. They had a lot of things going against them. And he was writing, trying to encourage them. The second thing I want you to see was, not only did he give them the proof, but he wrote a letter to try to help them to keep the proper perspective in life. Have you ever noticed how important it is to have the right perspective? You get up in the morning and you have a good perspective, you go out and try to accomplish things, you're probably going to get a lot more done than if you get up and you have a negative perspective and you go through life and everything is miserable. Sometimes we have to learn to just say, hey, you know what, I'm going to make the best of this and do what I can. What do I mean when I say having and keeping the proper perspective? Remember, these were people that heard it. Well, they were going to face and did face persecution. And they faced persecution not only from within, but also without. These are people that were dealing with poverty. When they would take their things to the marketplace, they were not allowed to sell them there. They were pushed out. They couldn't do it. So they were, fighting poverty. They were unemployed. They were unwelcome. The people around them didn't even want them there. They wanted to push them out of the town. So what do I mean by that? Well, they were persecuted. If you look at and study the scripture here, it talks about how they were persecuted even from within. There are people who called themselves Jews that really didn't follow Christ. And what they did was they actually accused the Jewish believers of all kind of things. They accused them of being unloyal to the king, of being unloyal subjects. They accused them, even though they took communion, and, through miscommunication, accused them of being cannibals. All type of things they accused them just to try to get them in trouble. And so Christians were greatly persecuted from within, and then they had from the people that were the citizens there from without, because this town was a center of emperor worship. And they even built a temple, and they were recognized by Rome even above Ephesus because of their great temple they built to worship the Emperor Tiberius. And so the Christians were in great persecution, and they were refused anything that they wanted to do. And then because they would not worship Nero, in AD 64, when Rome was burned, the Christians were accused of burning Rome, and because of that, they were persecuted. And it was during that time of persecution, if you look at it, it says there was 10 different persecutions, more than 10 years, 10 different persecutions that they had to go through, and all the apostles were martyred during this time with the exception of John. So I want you to see this was a great time of persecution. And maybe you're here today, and I don't know, maybe nobody else knows, and maybe you're suffering trials and persecutions. Sometimes they're from without. Sometimes they're from within, fighting your own self. And you have these great trials, and you think, wow, am I ever going to make it? It's going to be light at the end of the tunnel, and what am I going to do? When you look at the name Smyrna, what it means is myrrh. And if you know anything about myrrh, it's a fragrance that has to be crushed in order to be able to smell it. And even though the church was going through great persecution because of their loyalty, because of sticking to Christ, through these great trials, there was a fragrance coming from these people, sweet smelling unto the Lord, because they were able to endure tremendous challenges during this time. And we often today see people, maybe not in the same forms of persecution that they faced, but we see people who are struggling. We see Christians, believers who are struggling. They're battling to keep their faith. They're battling to keep faithful, and they say, can I do it? Can I continue to do it? We talked a few minutes ago about people who have been church members for what? 40, 50, 60 years. Well, you don't see that as much today. You see generations that don't even go to church. You see generations that don't know God. You see generations that are out there struggling, not knowing who to look to and where they can find help. Someone defined tenacity as this. It comes from a Danish fear trapper's principle. The next mile is the only one a person really has to make. Genghis Khan, the 13th century great Mongolian conqueror, he asked his philosophers to come up with a truth that would always be there to be unchangeable. And their quote was this too shall pass. And maybe you're here this morning and you're wondering, man, this trial I'm going through, is this ever going to pass? Am I ever going to be able to see the light at the end of this tunnel? And the problem I have is this ever going to get better? And God says, he was writing to encourage his people. He said, keep the proper perspective. Hang in there. Don't give up because of the last principle that he writes in this letter. First of all, he gave them the proof. He said, I want to prove to you who I am. I am the first and last. I've conquered death. I'm there for you. There's nothing I don't know that you're going through. And that's the same for us today. There's nothing that God doesn't know what we are experiencing. The second thing, he says, hang in there and keep the proper perspective. Don't give up. Don't quit. And then he ends it with what? A challenge. He ends up with the promise. He says, I want to make you a promise. Because I don't want to just end the letter there. I want to make you a promise that all this that you're going through is going to be worth it. That there is comfort ahead. There is light at the end of the tunnel. Let me ask you a question this morning. What is it, if you trust in God today, that you fear? Do you fear rejection? If you're consistent with your walk with Christ, do you fear rejection? Do you fear doubt? Are you scared to believe? Are you scared to fully trust in God? Are you scared to really fully trust him? Are you afraid that you're going to get rejected when you go and you talk about it? What is it that this morning maybe we are battling that we fear? Maybe you fear failure. You say, God, I've tried so many times before to actually read my Bible, to pray, to be consistent, and I'm afraid that I'll quit. I'm afraid that I'll be a failure. I try to live. I try not to do things I know I shouldn't do, and I'm afraid I'm going to fail, and I can't do it. What is it that scares you about your faith today? What is the challenges there? They had challenges, believe me. But we have challenges today, too. We have many that are struggling just to get up in the morning. We have many that are struggling with doubts, with fear, that are battling, saying, God, can I make it another day? You know what his promise is? He says, there is comfort ahead. And he tells us what? He says, don't be afraid. Have you ever told your kids that? Don't be scared, it's okay. Don't be afraid. I'm sure, Tish, you've never had to hear that because you're so brave. But have you ever heard that say, be brave, don't be afraid? Well, we tell that to our kids, we teach that to them. But until we experience it and go through the first time, maybe you're just learning to drive. And you're going to take it out, and you're learning it, or you're doing this, and until you do whatever is in life, until you do it, and you get through it, sometimes it's difficult. And God says, you know what? It doesn't make any difference what it is. He said, don't be afraid. It could be fear of a natural disaster, calamity that will come. It could be a fear of an illness. It could be fear of a job. He says, whatever it is, you don't have to live in fear all the time, because if you do, the focus will be on that and not be on God. And he says, you don't have to be afraid. He says, you know what? He said, because rewards await. He promised him, he said, if you are faithful and you continue to trust me, he said, the crown of life awaits for you. You know what that meant? That meant that you might have a tough time right now, but one day you're going to have a wonderful life for the rest of all of eternity that's going to be a whole lot longer than that you're suffering and going through now. He says, that reward awaits for you. You see, Smyrna was known, the nickname it had was the crowned city, because it was up on a hill, and then when sun would come down, it would glisten, and it would make it look like there was a crown that wrapped around the city. And so they would call it the crowned city, because it looked like it had a crown on it. And Christ spun it around and said, hey, they can have their crown here, but I promised you a crown of life that one day that you'll receive if you hang in there and you remain faithful even during a difficult time. And not only the crown of life, he says, you know what? You will receive rewards for whatever you did. The Bible teaches us that you accomplished in my name. You see, here, not everybody sees all the things that you've done. Not everybody may know all the things that you've accomplished, or the work, or the time that you put in. You hope that gets rewarded by other people seeing it, but sometimes it doesn't. But God looks down, he sees the interior of the heart. He says, even when other people don't see it, even when other people don't recognize it, I do, and I will give you rewards for the things that you've done in my name. We go back a few years to December 16th, 1944. There were 18 members of a reconnaissance unit and their platoon, and they held off a battalion of German stormtroopers in a Belgian hamlet. And you say, why is this so important? The reason it was so important, a few historical books actually give them the recognition they needed, didn't recognize it, because they gave the Allied forces time to prepare their defense to get ready, because they were fighting, getting ready for that famous Battle of the Bulge, where they were victorious. And they, by standing, gave the Allies the great time that they needed, and was a wonderful and gallant stand that they performed. But hardly anybody recognized what they did. One of the members of that 18-member team, his name was Will James. And he lived pretty much in obscurity for 40 years. He had several surgeries because of the injuries that he suffered. It wasn't until 1981, when at that time, the Speaker of the House was Thomas P. O'Neill, you might remember them, awarded him the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism, for what he had done, for the hero that he had accomplished, for what he had done. Not until 1981, he'd already passed. You see, sometimes God blesses us, and we see our rewards now. Other times you might say, Pastor John, it's tough being a believer in today's world. It's tough. Sometimes I get up and I think, it's hard to do this. Is it really rewarding? As we go through in life, we struggle and we face those challenges to keep it up, to keep serving, to keep ministering, to keep faithful. You hear that all the time. You keep asking the question, is it going to be worth it? Is it really worth it to invest my life, to invest my energy, to invest what I do in following him and serving him? And God says you have to keep the proper perspective, because remember, I've made a promise to you that it will be worth it, because one day, even though, remember, we're not going to receive all the rewards here, one day in heaven, for what you've accomplished in my name, that will be the real award ceremony, when that will be the time to look back at your life and say, you know what, there were times I wondered, there were times I was tired, there was times I was discouraged, there was times I was frustrated, but you know what, I look at it now and say, you know what, one day it will be worth it all. And those investments and those awards will never go away. You ever won a trophy? You ever won an award here? I remember growing up, getting those trophies, winning those things for sports things, and I was so excited to get those, and you're so thrilled to walk up and get those trophies. And now I look at them now, and the screws come undone. They change colors. They fall apart. I can't even remember what they were done for. Don't even know what they were. At the time, they meant a lot. But over time, I realized, you know what, you have to realize in life. It's nice to get those things because they mark progress. Nothing wrong with those. You still strive to do the best you can do and win those. But that's not the ultimate award. The ultimate award is learning how to love somebody, how to help somebody, how to care for somebody, how to teach somebody. Those are the ultimate awards that one day will make it worth something. So we ask the question as we close this morning. Have you been put down more times than you have been picked up? Is your bank account not what you would like it to be? Are you concerned about the future? Here's what Christ would say. He'd say, don't be afraid. Don't give up. It's not going to last forever. And remember this. I already have a sized life crown waiting